Welcome to this webinar for onboarding new economic development district directors. This webinar series is produced in part with the NATO Research Foundation with support from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. The purpose of this webinar is to highlight some of the key features within the new toolkit for new executive directors or aspiring executive directors for some of the nation's strongest economic development districts. My name is Steve Etcher, and I'm delighted to be your presenter today. I've had the opportunity to serve as the director of a regional development organization for more than 20 years. Since leaving that organization, I've been engaged in both organizational management expertise as well as site selection and economic development. And I enjoy my opportunities to work with the network of economic development districts across the country. If you need to contact me, please scan the QR code and my contact information will come up. I currently serve as a manager within a firm based out of Kansas City called Marks Nelson Advisors, LLC. So if you're watching this webinar, I would assume that you have either recently stepped into the role as executive director of an economic development district or are beginning to transition into the role as an executive director, or you may be aspiring someday to become an executive director of an economic development district. If that describes you, then my hope today is that you'll find not only a little bit of encouragement along the way as you take that step, but also that we give you some tools to better equip yourself to handle the onslaught of demands on your time, priorities that you'll need to establish, as well as some best practices and tips to make sure this journey is not only fulfilling and rewarding, but creates the impact that you really desire for your communities and for your region. So as you approach the idea of taking over an economic development organization, understand that this job is not necessarily for the faint of heart. Running an organization will require an enormous amount of time and energy that you may not have expended on other jobs that you may have had. It's truly a passion project to be running an economic development district, and I hope you will embrace it as such. Chances are taking over an economic development district is not something that you were specifically trained to do. You probably do not have a college degree in executive directorships for regional or economic development organizations. But what you will find quickly is that this type of an opportunity will require risk, it will require innovation, it will require you to navigate difficult terms and compromise as you move through that process. It will require new levels of leadership, as well as partnership and always constant professionalism to make sure you build a team around you that supports your organization and your vision. As you start that role as a new executive director, I often encourage new directors to look at it as you view a new president or new president's administration. Oftentimes, those administrations are evaluated by how effective they've been able to position their policies and agendas within their first 100 days in the office. I would challenge you as a new executive director to take that same mindset, to say in that first 100 days, you are going to create your own brand, your own demonstration of your abilities to lead this organization, that you will use that first 100 days to set the tone and to begin to build that reputation so you can create the impact that you truly desire to create in that organization. Whether you're new to the organization or you may be new to the region, you may be promoted from within, I believe it's very important that you be intentional in your efforts to grasp a complete understanding of what the organization is doing, what their mission and purpose is, as well as what the opportunities and challenges are as you move forward in the organization. I will assure you that at times this opportunity, this job will seem overwhelming, but I'd like to remind you that you're not the first person to take this step. And you will not be the last. There are networks of professionals out there to help you and mentor you and equip you to handle this responsibility that you've been entrusted with. There are resources out there to help you with certain aspects of managing an organization like this that you may not be familiar with. Please don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Reach out to your colleagues across the country and let them help you navigate these first 100 days. I often tell new directors that I believe the most important thing you can do to achieve success is to invest your time in creating trusting relationships with not only your collaborators and your constituency, but also with your staff and with your board. You need to constantly show excitement and enthusiasm and optimism and passion for what you're doing and what you want to do within that organization. Investing in relationships will produce some of the greatest returns your organization could possibly harvest. Also, I want to remind new directors and aspiring directors that you will become the face of the organization. So be ever mindful of what face you're presenting. Even though you may be overwhelmed, even though you may feel like you're drowning under all of this information, it's very, very important to remain upbeat and have a positive face for the organization. So as you kind of embark on this, the landscape that you're going to face will be varied across the country. There are a number of influences that can make your transition or introduction as a new director interesting. There may be positive things that have happened that have elevated the organization, or there may have been a lot of negative things that have happened that have diminished the capacity of the organization or even tarnished its reputation. The reality is you're following someone as a leader of that organization, and likely someone will follow you. So regardless of the past and inherited reputation of the organization, I would encourage you, I would challenge you to make your own positive impact on the organization and the region that you're serving. Who you are following will determine the types of challenges that lie before you. In this line of work, there are always challenges. The only variation is what will that challenge actually be? If you are following a successful director, you likely have very big shoes to fill. And if this is the case, the framework and the team is probably already in place. You just need to guide and direct the organization and put your personal touch on it. The challenge will likely be how to keep the machine working while imprinting your style upon it. If you're following a poor performer as a director, the challenge you are facing is probably more focused on how to rebuild the team, how to rebuild trust, how to develop systems to manage the processes that will allow you to have the positive influence that you desire on the organization and the region you serve. You may have inherited a strong and engaged board of directors, and the challenge will be to keep them engaged in spite of this change, to continue to instill confidence in them that the organization will move forward under your supervision. On the other hand, your inherited board may be completely disengaged, and when they hired you, they figured their responsibility was complete. The challenge for you will be to build an organization that is very board-driven, that allows you to garner support from the board members and get them to provide you their input, their perspectives, and their feedback. Don't let your board skirt their responsibilities. Ask them how they will measure your success, and then develop a reporting system for you to be able to communicate that success with them. You may have stepped into an organization that is in a really strong financial position. As much as this is desired, and certainly it is, there are likely challenges you will face to keep that organization building upon prior successes, to use that financial condition and position wisely to advance the region. If you stepped into a financial mess, you have my sympathy. However, don't be that director that says things were a mess when I got here and they're still going to be a mess for a long time, even under my leadership. Close that door, move on, and right that ship. Make sure you as a director are doing everything you can to correct the financial direction that the organization is going. Take the opportunity there to slowly and steadily build a financial base through good performance and strong stewardship. Every little success will be huge. So start working on those little successes first and let the wins begin to accumulate. The staff that you will be directing is likely not your own. They are not likely who you would have hired. That doesn't mean they aren't of great value. They likely understand the region and the organization culture, and they possess much of the institutional knowledge that you will need to be successful. If they have the right skills and competencies, you can build on that. However, you may have also inherited a staff that is just collecting a paycheck, may not have the skills and competencies that you need to drive that organization forward. If so, my recommendation would be to closely work with the staff to assess what attributes they have, to see where they fit into the organization, see what their passions are and their desires are, to see if you can leverage that to produce a positive outcome. They may just need to be redirected and better managed. Don't go in and immediately start letting people go. They actually may have the skills you need. They just may need you to manage them a little bit better. As a result of prior leadership, the organization culture may be very dynamic and exciting, or it may be completely dysfunctional. As a new leader, I would encourage you to embrace the culture if it's producing great results, and then slowly inject your influences over time. If it is dysfunctional, assess why it's dysfunctional, and then begin to deliberately shape it to your style. The biggest mistakes I've seen people make is trying to make too much change too quickly within an organization's culture. If the organization you're leading has been growing, your priority will be to understand why it has been growing and continue to nurture that and build on that. If it's been in decline, your priority will be to understand why it's in decline and then develop strategies that will stop and reverse the decline. If morale and enthusiasm and productivity is high, don't rock the boat. If it is low, then figure out strategies to build up morale, which will then elevate enthusiasm and ultimately improve your organization's productivity. Again, if it's positive, keep moving forward and then merge your personality and style into the organization. If it is negative, make timely and deliberate actions once you've conducted a proper assessment of the organization. Some common challenges you will likely face as you take on the role as a director. Oftentimes, if you're hired from within, one of the biggest challenges you're going to have is managing staff that were previously your peers. This is no easy task to juggle, but there have been many directors who have taken this step, and I would encourage you to reach out to them for best practices. It may also be challenging to work with a board that just sees you as a staff person because that is the relationship they've had with you for potentially years in advance of this transition. Take the time to cultivate relationships with your board members so they view you as a leader of the organization. Understanding the finances of an economic development district can be complex, and it's very important that you as the director embrace that challenge to make sure you clearly understand the financial activities, reporting, and responsibilities that you have as the director for an economic development district. Your grasp of financial knowledge will be paramount to your success. And we will have a second webinar talking specifically about financial management for new executive directors. It's going to be also important for you as a new leader to take time to look at the big picture. So oftentimes, if a staff member is hired from within, they're so used to project execution and project delivery and potentially even compliance that I said they often spend way too much time looking down at the paperwork instead of looking ahead to the future. So you as a new director need to constantly remind yourself to look at the big picture and have clarity about where you want to drive your organization and the region. It's also important that you have a really good understanding of the region itself, the geographic footprint that you serve. What is going on in that region? What are its key drivers? Who are the key players? You need to equip yourself with that knowledge so you can better navigate the development within that region. Again, as a new leader, it's important to understand organization culture and then shape it to fit your style. Everybody has their very own unique way of running an organization. They have their own unique value sets. They have their own unique preferences. Make sure that you slowly embed yours into that organization. A challenge that we often hear from new directors is they never realize the breadth of programs and services that an economic development district provides. It's important that as you as the director really have a clear understanding of all the various programs that you work with and work on, and we'll talk about those in future activities or future webinars as well. Some new leaders are not accustomed to staffs and their practices, particularly if you're hired from within. So take the time to understand how staff performs best so you're not rocking the boat when you first come in. Obviously, the biggest challenge most directors have is they want to hit the ground running. They just don't know in which direction to start running. And we hope through this webinar and through the toolkit that the NATO Research Foundation has produced, it will give you good direction as you hit the ground so you're running a good race. So how do you overcome all of these issues we just talked about? How do you overcome prior leadership? Number one, I think you have to create your own brand, your own reputation, and your own culture. Take the time to make sure you're communicating to your staff what your passions are, what your desires are, but then also communicate that to your board as well. It's important that as much time as you spend talking, you spend even more time listening and understanding what is currently going on. Then determine what, if anything, needs to change and figure out the best strategy to make that change happen. And thirdly, as you take on this huge task, you're going to be bombarded with information, with requests. I would encourage you daily to focus on what it is the organization's trying to achieve. What is their mission? And then how can you use your strength and your staff's strength to achieve that mission on behalf of the organization that you're leading? In order to do that well, I think you need to understand the landscape around that organization. And the first thing I would tell you to take a look at is the climate. What is the business climate in the region that you serve? What work is the organization currently doing on behalf of the region? What is the business climate out there? Are you a trusted advisor to your communities? Is it very cutthroat? Are there a lot of competitors out there? What is the actual environment in which you're asked to provide services? Who are your clients? Who are your members? Who are those that you're providing services to? Make sure you have clarity around that. And then make sure as well that what you're doing in that business environment really does align with the organization's mission and purpose. And of course, obviously understand who else is in that space, whether they be collaborators or competitors. You need to have a good grasp on the business climate. As a new director, you need to quickly come up to speed on what contracts you have an obligation to perform. So get a list of all the contracts that the organization currently is engaged in. Understand what the terms of those contracts are, understand the budget implications of those contracts, but also understand what's the status of the work being completed and what is the quality of that work. And probably as important as any of those things is you need to understand your communities. What is going on within your region? Who are the leaders within those communities that make up the broader region? What are their needs? What challenges are they facing? What level of engagement do they currently have with your organization? Are they interacting? And if so, what has that interaction been like? But most importantly, the question you need to be able to answer for yourself is, what do they want from your organization? And how best can you serve them? And lastly, you really need to understand your constituents. And this is more than just the cities or member governments that you're working with. But what is your region really comprised of? Are there special demographics that you need to be aware of so you can make sure that you are responding well to those? You may be having services provided to the elderly. You may be dealing with these people who are, transportation dependent. You may have housing deficiencies. You may be working with a lot of disadvantage, either from an educational perspective or from an income perspective. So make sure you have a clear understanding of the constituents that make up your region. As I said earlier, it's important to understand who's in the region. So take time to do a regional scan. Understand who the potential collaborators are or the existing collaborators are. Oftentimes, what we find is some of the best collaborators are your non-for-profit organizations, your educational institutions, and community organizations that are really aligned around issues that you're trying to advance as an organization as well. And last but not least, also engage with and collaborate with your economic development organizations. You are, after all, an economic development district, and that should be part of your scope and mission. But it's also important to understand what are the competitors out there in that marketplace as well. Are there overlapping organizations such as housing authorities or transit providers or employment offices, social services providers, et cetera? Are there consultants out there that are trying to provide the same level of services and opportunities that you do? And if so, where are those consultants finding opportunities? And you need to ask yourself why. Why is that the solution that those entities have chosen to work with? And sometimes your city and county staff can be your competitors. They can also be your collaborators. So just understand the dynamics within your region so you're not stepping on a landmine accidentally. As a new director, I cannot stress enough how important it is to know your region. Not just the cities and the counties that you service, but the populations within those. Any unique demographics you need to understand. You need to understand how that community is growing or declining. You need to understand some of the drivers behind that. You need to understand any income impairments, any housing impairments. You need to understand within the individual communities within your broader region, what are the key challenges they're facing? What have been some of the historic disruptions that have impacted your region? And what are some likely disruptions that could impact your region in the future? And knowing that and talking about that will make you a trusted advisor within that region. And that's an important role for you to fill. You need to understand your transportation systems because so much of what you're going to be involved with either is dependent upon or participating in the development of our transportation systems. And lastly, and certainly not least, is understand the infrastructure components and capacity within your region, whether that be water or sewer or electricity or gas, or even social infrastructure. Make sure you have a good grasp on what your knowledge, what your region has to offer the outside world. As you embark on this new endeavor as leading an organization, one of the most important things that you need to steward is your board. Your board of directors can be an incredible asset to your organization. You need to know, as the new director, what is that governance structure like, and how can you use that structure then to maximize the value that the board members provide to your organization. You need to know who your members are. You need to understand how they are appointed or elected. You should also review prior board meeting minutes just to get an idea of the board engagement and who's taking what responsibilities. You need to review the existing board meeting packets to make sure they're an effective tool for you to actually govern. And if you need to make adjustments, make sure you make them in a manner that it really reflects your management style. You need to understand the preferred meeting format, the date, the time, the length of the meeting, the preferred agenda layout, and get a good grasp on the governance structure so you can navigate that opportunity well. If you need resources for effectively running board meetings and how to work with the board of directors, there's limitless resources out there. And I would encourage you to reach out to the Native Research Foundation, among others, to get tips and techniques on making that effective. But as you kind of begin thinking about your role with your board of directors, it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities of you as the CEO or the director and your board members. Your board members have a responsibility to set policies and help you develop goals and priorities for organization. They're there to provide general guidance and counsel to you as the director, and you should be leaning into them for that guidance and counsel. Their job is to ensure that there's financial integrity of the organization, to make sure they're the final checks and balances in many of your processes. They're your best sales team, so make sure they are nurturing the vision for the organization. Make sure they are overseeing you as the executive director, and that requires them to periodically assess your performance of not only your role as the executive director, but also assess the performance of the organization as a whole. And they also have a responsibility to participate ethically and knowledgeably in your board meetings. As the director, your job is different. You carry out the policies and the priorities of the board. Your job is to manage the day-to-day operations of the organization. Your job is to principally be the steward and the gatekeeper for all the organization's relationships. You oversee the staff. You assess the performance of the staff. But then your job is to take all of those activities and report that back to your board of directors so they feel like they're engaged in part of the activity. You need to report your performance as a director and your performance and impact of the organization to the region as a whole. It is also important that you understand that in order to be effective, regional councils are political entities that must function politically to be highly effective, but they must do so in a nonpartisan manner. As a director, please do not get yourself involved with partisan politics. So as you lead with the board of directors, just a few key best practices that I think will make your job a little bit easier. Number one, have regularly scheduled meetings that will encourage ongoing participation. Have a structured meeting format that will use their time well. Have an agenda and stick to it. Stay within the time constraints you set up for a meeting. Personally, I believe if you cannot conduct a meeting's activities within 90 minutes, you need to restructure how you're performing that meeting function. Utilize committees, if appropriate, to take some of that heavy lifting off of the board meeting time to actually come forward with a recommendation. It's important that you also communicate a sense of ownership with that board of directors. Make sure they understand your enabling legislation and why they are such a critical cog in that. Constantly reinforce their ownership versus your ownership as the executive director. When working with the board, act on their opinions. Allow them to take ownership in the ideas that they generate. I've always had the mentality, it doesn't matter who gets the credit as long as we get the results. And I would encourage you to take that same mindset as you're working with your board of directors. It's important that you provide value to your board members to keep them engaged and keep them active in your organization. And you can do that with quality information and by producing results from various projects. Do not drown your board members with data. Make sure you filter and interpret that data so it's really meaningful information to them. And always and continually educate your board so they're more aware of what you're doing as an organization and what your organization's impact is within the region. And when you have new board members due to elections and turnovers, it's important that you immediately get out there and educate those newly elected officials and board members for your organization. So as we kind of wrap up this first webinar series on this toolkit for new executive directors, a couple of things I just want to end with to hopefully reinforce some key points. Number one, don't rush to make changes. Make changes only after you have a full understanding of the issues and you really thought through the various alternatives. And make sure that you are confident that these are the best changes that you can make for the organization. Take time to understand the environment around you. Please don't concede to always doing things like they've always been done. I would hope that you're a talented professional who was hired because of your talents and your abilities. So use those talents, use those abilities, and make that an opportunity to inflect meaningful change within the organization. As a new director, you can never stop learning. You need to continually develop your skills and your organization's capacity. If there's an area that you lack confidence in or you don't have the abilities in, go find training to shore that up, or find staff that can fill that gap for you. Find a mentor to help guide you. Look internally as well for staff that has that ability, or again, as I said, hire strategically to offset any shortcomings you feel that you have or the organization may have. Always be growing and learning. Just because you have the job does not mean you've finished your journey. You're traditionally just starting a wonderful journey ahead of you. But in order to really be an effective leader, you must continually educate yourself on the latest trends, the best practices, to make sure you really are a trusted advisor to your board and to the communities that you've been entrusted to serve. There are so many economic development or professional development opportunities out there. I would encourage you to make that a priority for you and your staff. If we can ever provide any assistance to you as a new director, I would encourage you to reach out. My contact information is provided here. I would also encourage you to reach out to NATO and the NATO Research Foundation for additional resources to help you get on board as a new director of an economic development district. Thank you.